Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. In today's episode, we continue the conversation we started last week with Mark and Donna Weigt. In last week's episode, they shared their journey of healing after having 3 miscarriages before deciding to adopt. If you missed that conversation, then I want to encourage you to go back and listen to them share on that topic because it was really powerful. In the second half of our conversation, they share how they walk couples through the overall struggle of infertility, things that help your marriage as you go through that, and deciding on adoption. This is the second half of my conversation with Mark and Donna. I'm sure there's this desire for biological kids, but there's just so much challenge in that. How do you walk couples through? I mean, they move past miscarriage or they never were able to get pregnant in the first place. How do you walk them through that whole process? Maybe it ends in adoption, maybe it ends in a medical stuff that helps, but just the long waiting of infertility.
I think when Mark and I first got married, actually, we knew we always wanted to adopt. So that's really important that you feel that you're called to adopt, and also that you're called as a couple to adopt, because it cannot be something that just one of you want to do.
Yeah, it can be very tough. Yeah, it can be very tough. I think one of the things that we did really well, and I don't know why we decided to do this, okay, but now when we talk to couples, we walk them through this every time. And most couples aren't even thinking about this. And we always say, if they're struggling getting pregnant at that point, okay, whether they've had miscarriages or they just can't get pregnant, and they're thinking of maybe going down the medical route in some way, which is okay. I always say 2 things, and we always say, pre-decide together how far you guys will go in this process. And you guys just pray about it, talk about it, and go, before we start, this is where we are together, unified as a couple to go, this is it. And if we don't get past this, then God obviously wants us to go in a different direction. Okay. And the reason why we do that is because we've talked to so many couples and they haven't. And then all of a sudden they get in there and all of a sudden all the emotion starts to take over, rightfully so, because it's an emotional process.
Yeah.
And then they're like, let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Or they don't think about some of the, which is the second part, some of the ethical things that you need to think about as you go through that process that are really important to pre-decide. Otherwise, just things are just being fired at you. And the couples that decide in advance, I've noticed that not only if they can't have kids through that process, not only is their marriage stronger, but they seem to eventually, as they grieve that, they seem to have more resolve as they go through the adoption process.
What is how do you have any tools for how somebody would go through the process of pre-deciding? Is that doing all the research and just sharing what each person's comfortable with? Is that how do you meet? Is there's a middle ground?
Yeah. One thing that's really helpful is to talk to another couple that have adopted or went through the fertility process, because then you can speak with someone and have questions openly and then find out from their experience.
No doubt. Because the fertility process, once again, it changes a lot, and there's changes in science and advancements of that and all that stuff. So it's really important for that. And then the adoption process, it can be a pretty intimidating process because it's like there's where and when and how. And I mean, it's an intimidating process for sure.
How do you balance? Because there's, like you mentioned, the emotions of the whole situation, right? Not only are there's ups and downs of you wanting kids, but maybe there's an adoption, or maybe you're in the middle of trying medical intervention, but you're still mourning the process of, it hasn't looked the way you want it to look. How do you balance all those things together?
That was hard.
How did you do it?
I prayed a lot, and I knew that God was going to have something for us. Maybe it was, but Mark and I definitely, part of what we went through the process is I just had said, I can't go through that again. So that helped a lot to start the healing process, or otherwise I would have still been grieving for a long time.
That was hard though, because all of a sudden you realize we're never going to see what our kids would have looked like, if we would have had kids biologically. Yeah. You gotta grieve that and say goodbye to that. And that's really hard to do because you don't think about that. All of a sudden it's like, well, no, this is a reality. So that's really, you got to take time to grieve that and do that. That's really hard.
What does it look like to grieve that? Because I know that there's all sorts of different things, and there's cultural ways of grieving, and there's, kind of what we have in some ways, which is, grieving means stuffing it under the rug,
Yeah. That means hiding and avoiding.
Yeah.
Grieving is this. You see it. That's why I love the Psalms and all that stuff, because you see this time and time again. Grieving means here's what I've lost, and you define what that is. And it's here's what I wanted, here's what I won't have, or here's what I won't lose, and then saying goodbye to that. And so the Psalms, and you got to lament that. You look at some of the Psalms of lament where this is what they're doing. They're going, okay, God, this is what I wanted. Here's what I won't have. I say goodbye, and I trust you still. And, we journaled a bunch with that. I mean, we took time for that and just really invited God in, talked about it and all that stuff. And then we just got to a point where we said, okay, we're ready to take the next step. And everyone's journey with that is different as far as the timing is concerned.
How much of that is this may be a weird question. How much of that is a joint mourning versus like giving each, you, Mark, you, Donna, like separate space to be able to do that separately?
I think it's separate.
Yeah, it was separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of separate because you're just at different places in that whole thing.
Was there ever a time where one of you wanted to move forward and the other person wasn't ready yet, or vice versa?
Do you mean with adoption or infertility?
Adoption, either one.
I probably would have had kids faster.
She probably would have had kids faster.
It's because I'm older. I was ready sooner. And Mark had an amazing dad, and I think probably would have liked kids sooner too.
Yeah, now I would have. I think in the adoption process, I think she was further ahead than me, but I was just okay going forward. Okay, I just we do have this funny story. Okay, so when we're learning about adoption, this is great. We never told this publicly. So we're in this adoption. We're still learning about it, and we're in this. We're in this adoption agency. Remember, we're in Lexington.
That was a crisis pregnancy center.
Yeah, and so we're sitting in there talking, and the lady was like really monotone and boring, and I fell asleep. And Donna was like, "You fell asleep during the event." I go, honey, she was really boring. I couldn't take it anymore.
She was basically interviewing us to see if we would be a fit for us.
I was out cold, man. I mean, I was out cold. Donna was just mad. What are you doing? Really she was mad.
All right. So the takeaway is go when you're fully rested. If we can draw anything from that.
We got done in Marco. She was really boring. I couldn't stay awake.
Oh my goodness. So kind of a theme that's kind of come up a lot is just being on the same page.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Do you have any tips for how to do that?
Once again, that's the pre-deciding.
Yeah.
All the time pre-deciding. You got to have the conversations in advance and then go, this is how far we'll go. And then we will have the discipline to go, we believe that this is what God has led us to this point, and that God might have a different direction for us. You got to do it. And then I even tell couples, write it down, sign it, and put it somewhere.
If a couple can't agree, one's willing to do adoption, one doesn't want to do adoption, how do they walk through that?
I'm going to be perfectly honest. You shouldn't do it if you're not both on the same page, John, because it puts a lot of stress on your marriage.
Yeah, I would too, because adoption, for a lot of people, adoption is like this glamorous type thing, and it's awesome and it's important and it's essential in a lot of ways because there's so many kids that need homes and stuff. But it is also can be very challenging, difficult, not glamorous. It is if they're not on the same page, it'll tear them up. It'll tear them up later potentially.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I'm not hearing you guys say separate. What you're saying is don't adopt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not until you're on the same page.
Yeah.
Or unless you're on the same page.
So throughout this process, there's a few emotions I've kind of not necessarily heard from you guys as you guys been talking, but I've heard as I've researched the topic, a lot of emotions going into the process of feelings towards people who do have or in the process of having biological kids. Maybe a friend says, oh, they're pregnant, or a friend just has their kids. How do you prevent those feelings of like bitterness and jealousy that could so easily crop up?
I think it was really hard at first because we actually went to California, had the one miscarriage. Our friend actually was pregnant that we stayed with out there, and they were so gracious in not letting us know because of what we had just went through. But I don't remember. I think I was still mourning so much that it didn't impact me as much. But now I'm really happy when someone can have a biological child, but I feel we're very blessed to have our kids too, though.
Yeah, I didn't really think about it that much because I tried to separate, and I think it's really important that we celebrate other people's successes. Let's just call it that. Okay. And it's hard to do, but there's something that just forms gratitude in our hearts when we do that. And so it's really easy to go, woe is me. And it was really easy for us to go, woe is me. And so to really fight against that, to go, no, God, you're doing something in their lives, and we're going to celebrate that. And we're not going to let our situation at this point affect their story. We're going to celebrate that.
Yeah. I've read and heard that it's really common to experience shame around infertility. One, I don't know if that was part of your guys' journey. How does somebody kind of work through and heal from that?
Yeah, I think the shame thing, I think anytime there's shame feelings, okay, so this is this big picture, whether pregnancy or something else, the shame goes away when it's exposed, okay? So that means whatever is causing that, wherever you're feeling that, the embarrassment, whatever it is, you need to go and tell someone. Because when you do, you bring it to the light, and then shame loses its power in our lives. And so the best thing you can do, as difficult as that is when you feel that, go find a person or two that you trust and go, hey, this is what we're doing. And hey, I'm feeling this way. And then all of a sudden shame loses its grip. You got to expose shame. And here's the thing. It's okay. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with
biological.
Nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with you.
Mark helped me through that process because once we did get pregnant, there was a while that I thought, well, I couldn't carry kids, but he would tell me, he goes, I didn't marry you to have kids.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I think, there is this idea of, a couple talks about having a family and all that stuff. And then, we still to this day don't know why we couldn't have biological kids. That's the interesting thing. We still don't know the reason.
We didn't want to.
We didn't have any medical issues. And so anyways, I think that conversation, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
It really is. No, it's okay. Nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. God's just moving in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
What were your kind of prayers? How are you communicating and growing with God through the infertility, the adoption process?
I think it was interesting because like I said, when you go through the adoption process, it's like this big black hole you go into because there's so many different ways you could take, and, pluses and minuses, pros and cons, and just all this stuff. And so you're like, just, what do I do? And where do I go? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay. And there's a financial aspect to go along with that. No one likes to talk about that, but that's true. Okay. So it's just like this, okay, God, we don't know what to do here. I mean, that's at first. And then all of a sudden for us, it was like, okay, well, what are some non-negotiables for us that are important? And one of them was, because of the miscarriages, we decided that we weren't going to adopt locally because there's a risk there. And I'm not saying don't adopt locally. This was just us, okay, where we were.
So these are some of the things that you should talk about.
Yeah.
If you're called to adopt.
So we just said, here's why we're not going to adopt locally, because of these things. And then I was like, okay, well, we're going to adopt internationally. Well, next question is, well, where are you called to adopt internationally? And so you start to pray, and you start to then talk to people and agencies in different countries and all that stuff. And then And then I think at the end, I would have just changed it and said, God, before we're going to talk to anybody, we're going to take a season and just say, hey, God, open up the opportunity you have for us. Mm. And then when we felt like we had a piece about it, then we would start calling places and talking to different countries and agencies. And I think it would have gone much quicker. Mm. I do, because I think God's will, here's the thing I know. God's will, if the marriage is right and everything's in line and all that stuff, God's will is for us to adopt. He wants kids to have homes. Mm. And so we're praying according to his will. He wants to move and he wants to show us that. I would have done that different.
Mm. You mentioned a few times this idea of being called to adopt. What does that mean?
I think it means that you're both on the same page in that way. And you just have done your research on, because it's a big, huge commitment. Even more so, I think, than having biological kids. Part of it is because you don't realize any health information or health history information. So there might be challenges that you might adopt an infant and find out later that there are things that might need more concerns to be looked at.
Yeah, and I think for us, called to adopt, we talked about it. And this is just our story. It's not everybody's story.
Yeah.
We're like, man, there's a lot of kids that need homes. And we'd love to have our home used for raising one of those great children. Hmm.
That's when we didn't know we were going to get twins.
Yeah. You found that out a week before, though, right?
We had gotten everything we were supposed to from our adoption agency and our reports and all that. And then I called back to tell them that we were adopting twins and they had to rewrite everything.
Wow.
We only wanted to have one child.
Well, as we kind of wrap up this whole conversation, I'm curious, is there anything else you'd want to share or someone to know if they're going through this process?
I think to make sure that you can come along or you have someone that has been through the process, to make sure you talk with them and pray about what God wants you to do next. And definitely, like Mark and I said, be on the same page and what your choices and decisions are.
I think I think for couples, and we're obviously in this because we went through it. I think this is a strenuous, challenging thing for couples. And if you don't, as a couple, first off, if it's miscarriages, if you don't, as we kind of talked earlier, invite people into that process and communicate well with each other, and invite God into that process to heal and all that stuff. If it's fertility, to make sure you're communicating and you have decided, okay. And then if it's adoption, learn as much as you can by talking to people who have adopted. And as a couple, once again, God really is our families matter. And so I've just seen God just do some cool things in couples that they're thinking, oh man, this is horrible. And it's horrible. It is during that time. But man, God is just so intimately involved and he cares and he's got a plan for it. Even when there's miscarriages and stuff like that, God's plan isn't miscarriages, but he'll use that and he'll go, hey, don't give up. I've got something for you guys. Just hang in there. Just come on. And you come out of that. I don't want to say strong because that sounds cliche, but we appreciate our family because of our story. Just, I don't want to say so much more, but just in a different way. And it may be at a different level because we couldn't. And this is the path God took us.
That's so powerful. I love the consistent faithfulness and throughout your entire story, just constantly talking about walking with God and prayer and the power of being able to do it with others. And thank you so much for sharing your story and the hard parts, the challenging parts, and the parts that swing up and are just filled with hope. And like you end there, just so much joy at the end. So thank you.
Oh, of course.
Thank you, John.
And Donna, thanks for helping balance out Mark there. That was great.
I'll never be asked again. Should take my spot. That's good.
Well, that was the second half of my conversation with Mark and Donna, and I want to thank them again for sharing their experience. And I think my biggest takeaway really is the concept of pre-deciding and communication, and just how important that is before you go through a really challenging and emotional process. I don't think that just applies to the struggle to have biological kids and adoption, but so many other things in a relationship as well. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.